hope you all hear me well. So to cite Henry, it's the last day. Are you all excited?
Yes.
So yeah, welcome to the last day of this workshop. Last but not least, I'm Sandra Gesing, and you have heard me if you joined on Monday already in a talk. I'm from the University of Notre Dame, a research assistant professor and computational scientist, and part of the Science Gateway Community Institute and the ERSI, the US Research Software Sustainability Institute. I'm happy to present the panel. I'm happy to have only a mini talk, and then you can grill the panelists with your questions. So let me go to my slides. Yeah, my slides. So we are talking about user experience, visualization, and usability this morning. And I really like this citation, so I will really read it, because Steve Group brought that out already in 2005, and the title of the book is already very nice. Don't Make Me Think. I really love that title. It's a common sense approach to web usability. And he said, after all, usability really just means that making sure that something works well, that a person can use the thing, whether it's a website, a fighter jet, or a revolving door, for its intended purpose without getting hopelessly frustrated. That is exactly what we want for our users. We want them to use HPC without getting frustrated. And I also found this one graphic on Facebook. A user interface is like a joke. If you have to explain it, it's not that good. Exactly. If you have to explain a user interface, then it's not good. And user experience. What can we say about user experience? Yes, when people are taking up your solution. And this is one graphics you might have seen already on Monday, but this shows also the Exceed users. And there was already a break between using HPC and Exceed via command line, the login, or via gateways in 2014. So the numbers changed already between going via command line in or via gateway. That what you see in this graphic is that there was a real huge uptake in 2006. That was ITASA in Cyprus. And now 77% of active Exceed users are really going via Science Gateways onto the resources. So what does it mean? Yes, that is their user experience. They like to have a web user interface to Exceed. They like to use the resources via web interfaces. And if you look at visualization, I mean, there's, the saying, an image says more than 1,000 words. Yes, it says. If you look on the left side, this is a molecular structure binding to a small ligand. And if you would see the original energy file, I wouldn't see anything in that. But if I have the graphical representation that there's a binding pocket, that it fits into that you can turn it around until the energies are fitting, then you can see something. Or if I would have told you for the right side, oh yes, we had this, survey, and 62%, cannot do their work in research without research software. 30% cannot really continue. They could continue their work, but with much more effort. And then I show you on the other side, yeah, but 30% have only received formal training. If you see a mismatch between the training, the education, and how research software is needed in our field. And that was my short introduction. And now we are coming to the questions. But before we coming to the questions, I let the panelists introduce themselves. First, Chris Weaver, he's on site. And I give you the microphone, and please eat it.
Or something. Hello, good morning. My name is Chris Weaver. I'm a professor in the School of Computer Science here at the University of Oklahoma. As a matter of fact, a long time ago, I used to be in this building as part of the Center for Spatial Analysis. My area of expertise is visualization, specifically information visualization and visual analytics. Most of what I do relates to interaction and the development of new approaches to interaction. My biggest project at the moment, funded by NSF, is to try to develop gesture-based data editing that works directly within visualizations. Visualization, for the most part now, is about displaying data that you already have. The data kind of goes up on a pedestal and then it gets shown to you, and the purpose of visualization is to disseminate conclusions that are already there. I want to bring humans more into the loop by allowing them to interact with the data, add data, change the data as a way to record their observations and their thinking processes. Right? So lots of interaction in visualizations.
Thank you, Chris. So now I give it to Dana.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dana Brunson. I'm just up the road at Oklahoma State University. Let's see, I lead the research computing efforts here. I'm an assistant vice president for research cyber infrastructure and the director of the HPC Center. And I also have been doing a lot of work with the Campus Champions. I'm part of the Exceed project on that, and more recently taking a bigger role in what Scott Yokel talked about yesterday, the Campus Research Computing Consortium. So mostly I just tell other people that these things are important and try to be a strong advocate and bring people together to share information like this. But over the past 10 years, I started with just an HPC center of one, so got to engage with researchers of a variety of sorts and seen how it's evolved over the last 10 years. Yeah.
Thank you, Dana. Paul?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Paul Parsons. I'm an assistant professor at Purdue University. I'm also involved in the Science Gateways Community Institute with Sandra, and there I lead the usability and user experience consulting work. My background is in computer science and cognitive science, and I do research in the areas of human-computer interaction, information visualization, and user experience design.
So other questions before I ask any questions? In TV land. Okay, so let's go to our first question. So you all three collaborate research disciplines? Questions here, because other challenges all disciplines have in common in regard to your area topic? What are challenges which are dependent on the discipline? So the first couple of questions are more like, how do you work with the different disciplines? Do you have experienced many different, or do you experience many differences in the collaboration with diverse disciplines? Or is there a discipline you would like to collaborate much more with because you are sure it would be beneficial for both sides? But there is a kind of culture gap or another hurdle? I give it first to Chris.
This is a very good question for me, actually. When I first came to OU, I was hired as part of the radar initiative to work with the electrical engineers and the meteorologists building the polar magic radar systems here. But my area is really information visualization. Since then, I've kind of moved through geovisualization and various kinds of information visualization applications. But most of my work these days is actually working in the digital humanities. And I have a large Mellon Foundation project with Sam Husky in the Department of Classics to try to visualize the structure of reconstructed classical Latin texts, which turns out to be an incredibly complicated kind of data, right? Which is quite a bit different from the kinds of tabular data, simple tabular data that one tends to have in scientific disciplines. The areas and the way that the people working in those areas think about their data and approach problems of exploration and analysis are also quite a bit different between those different areas. And the meteorologists tend to approach things quite scientifically, rigorously. They're rigorous about their data. They have longstanding practices about how they collect data and bring tools to bear on that data, including different kinds of visualization, like data processing and software development and visualization themselves as well. Whereas in the digital humanities, there is relatively little software development and data analysis experience, but they have longstanding practices in terms of how they go about studying the information that they have. There's still information out there. They still have observable phenomena in the form of classical texts. There's still practices that they follow to collect that data and work through that. And so in these different fields, we have to kind of bring to bear the knowledge of the different processes and the different norms that they follow, their different considerations for whether or not their work is successful, to the design processes for the visualization and the kind of ways that we display data and for what purposes. For a scientist, a visualization is often a way to present some pattern that they've concluded from the phenomenon that they're observing, right? So for instance, the structure of a rotation in a storm cell. Whereas a classic scholar might be interested in showing off the fine-grained variations in short sequences of texts and to be able to construct a historical story about how the interpretation of that section of text has changed over the last 2,000 years, both through copying by people who copied books, and that had to be done, and more recently by classic scholars who try to reconstruct what they think the original texts look like. So part of the problem for me in collaborating with these diverse disciplines has been spending a substantial amount of time just understanding what they work and what they really care about. And for me, kind of setting aside my own presumptions about how people should or you can go about data processing. I kind of have to approach the whole thing as a neutral methodologist.
Great, thanks, Chris. Dana, you want to go next?
Sure. So I think part of what I wanted to get across is that, you know, we've had this HPC center and it started out like most do, you know, with the traditional, you know, physicists and chemists and then engineers. And so you have these traditional HPC rules about limited wall times and purging scratch file directories that made it really hard for newer disciplines to use those resources. So like when the biologists first came in and they needed a lot more space in the storage and they needed longer wall times because those applications didn't necessarily run within 24, 48 hours. You know, we've always had this mission of just helping the researchers first. And so we've always allowed much longer wall times and much longer storage spaces for that. And then when it got to the the GIS folks and wanting to use ArcGIS, for instance, there was no way we could do that because that's a Windows desktop application. And luckily we got funding, and that's when we built our little virtual server pool Tiger. So it's the interactive graphical environment for research. And I think Evan might be on here. He's the one that runs it. But that has allowed us to make it so people can basically do anything once they get stymied by their desktop. So we have Windows machines, Linux machines, we can put web applications on here. And it's been an incredible way to engage researchers and not have to turn. Linux processing was not something that was in their workflow. So when we engage anyone now, we can say, okay, you know, what are you doing right now? And what do you want to do? And then we work with them to see how we can help them move forward. The other new group we have here at OSU is a digital humanities group, and they're just beginning. And so the approach we've taken is to go to their symposia and just learn what they're doing. And then after some of their meetings, they go have beer. And that's a really great way to build relationships. and so they don't necessarily need any of our advanced computing resources yet, but as they grow, they know we're there to talk to them. And I think probably the last piece of the puzzle is really the carpentries. And again, and I think Philip might be on here, and he's the one that leads our community carpentry effort. And he's managed to build this community of instructors and helpers and reached hundreds of people on campus that may never know that our center even exists, except for they start getting interested in the data carpentry and things like that. So it helps just get the word out there that we're very approachable. And I'm lucky to have a team that feels the same way. And I think that's all for now, I think.
Thank you. You have directly a question from TV Land.
What is our funding? The funding model for Tiger, so it's EPSCoR. There's a Track 1 grant that goes for 5 years. If you're from an EPSCoR state, you might know about that. It's a statewide thing, and they funded the hardware for that. And then we got internal funding for Evan's position to run it. And so he does basically figuring out what the hardware should be to collaborating with the researchers to use it.
Thank you. And Paul?
Yeah, okay. So I think usability is really a cross-cutting kind of discipline. I've done usability consulting and development kind of work with people doing chemistry education, apps, to genetics, to people tracking storm systems and visualizing them. So I've kind of worked all across the board, and I think the issues that come up tend to be more or less the same. When we're talking about usability, we're looking at things like learnability. So how easy is it for somebody to come and figure out how to use your website or your app or your system? We look at things like efficiency, error recovery. So how do we make sure that people either don't make errors, or if they do, they can recover from them easily. And all the users are and what they need and what's good for their tasks. And there are various methods for doing that, and those tend to be fairly generic and applicable across all disciplines as far as I've seen. I think the main difficulty actually is not really, so I haven't found a particular difficulty with any discipline, but the main difficulty is actually understanding what people are talking about and what their needs are within a particular discipline. So if I'm working with an ecologist, I don't know much about that space, and I need to figure out what kind of concepts and terms they use, and how to make sure that they're developing their sites or their products in the best way. And so I would say that's the biggest challenge, and that's also a cross-cutting challenge. And there are various methods that can be employed to help with that. I'd say the only I don't know if there's a particular discipline that I haven't worked with that I'm really dying to, but I haven't done usability work with people in the humanities, doing digital humanities work, for instance. So I think that would be interesting, and I would enjoy doing that. And I would expect that the challenges would still be pretty much the same, and the methods that I would use would probably be also the same too.
Thank you very much, Paul. So let's go to, is there a question in between? So let's go to the next question. So what would you tell someone who states that user experience, usability, and visualization are nice to have topics in research computing, but efficiency and effectiveness of software and hardware are by far the major topics for research computing?
When I teach my human-computer interaction class, one of the first ideas I introduce is that there's always people involved in every form of computation that you're doing. And so to someone like this, I would say that the efficiency and effectiveness of computing depends on inherently on the ability of whatever data that you're inputting or outputting to be part of a conversation, to put it in abstract terms, with whatever people are interacting with it. Efficiency is not just a matter of computational efficiency, it's the efficiency of the user interface to communicate results to the person who's viewing that computation through the user interface. And there's always a user interface. Even if you're talking about a machine learning researcher trying to develop an algorithm, they're still working through a terminal and looking at the data sets that are being output by, say, a neural network or something like that. There's always a human in the loop there. And so human efficiency and human effectiveness are an integral part of every piece of software or every software plus hardware system that you happen to build. So they're not just nice to have things, they're an essential part of that efficiency and effectiveness.
Thanks, Chris. Dana?
So I think it's a great question. It reminds me of most disciplines that, you know, anytime there's focus areas, they all think that their own is the most important one. But I think if we think about what the goal of this overall is to get new knowledge and insight and what gets us there sooner. Now, if you're doing weather modeling or energy physics, then efficiency and optimization and all those things are really important for those cases. But if you're trying to bring in people that haven't had access to these tools, that these tools are going to make huge differences in the discoveries that they can make, then bringing those to them in a way that makes it better for them to use is going to get you new knowledge and insight sooner and faster. I think, you know, one thing I try to tell people is like, you know, hardware is cheaper than human time. Well, it depends on the problem, right? If you're using, you know, Blue Waters or something, then that's a pretty expensive machine. But if you're using like the science gateways and things, you know, just look at all the people that have been able to advance their work using those and save all their human time for the research that is their focus area. So I think, you know, usability, visualization, and user experience are extremely important, but there's room in our ecosystem for people to do all of those jobs.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, so people have fought that battle already. And I think nowadays, there's not as much of a need to sort of defend the role of usability and visualization and user experience. In the early days of usability becoming more widespread, which was probably in the early 90s, people were defending the role of usability and having to provide metrics and so on to provide some kind of concrete evidence. I think since then, the idea of usability has become more common in not just for developers and researchers, but also just general users because of the fact that they're familiar with their iPhones and tablets and so on. And there have been countless studies now showing the role that usability and user experience plays in in the acceptability and success of various software projects, and that includes large corporations who do usability studies. There are all kinds of case studies about those that show considerable return on investment, and even startups that do very simple usability work tend to show a strong benefit. So I think there's that kind of evidence. There's an alternative to what you're providing. People will use the alternative if it provides a better user experience, and I think that's important to keep in mind. So I think that's my short answer.
Thank you, Paul. So there's a question from TV Land, Paul. Maybe you can read it and directly also answer it. It's to all of you. You see the question in the...
Yeah, you want me to read it from Jack Smith? This one, is that the right one? Yes, I think you're muted. I don't hear you.
Yes. Yes, please read that and answer it.
Okay, so this question is from Jack Smith to all. Do you see traditional batch computing being supplanted by gateways and other on-demand interactive environments that do all the heavy lifting, resource provisioning, batch job submission, distributed behind the scenes? Does it?
I do. I'm sure you do too. Yeah, I think as soon as you can, right? I'm sure nobody here does their laundry by hand anymore, right? We have machines that'll do that for us. Same thing with most technology. As soon as it makes us frees up our time. Yeah. The answer is supposed to be yes, says Jack. But of course, right? And it's only if you need. Well, it's just like when you're using point and click tools. Those might be fine if that's faster, but as soon as you need it, do it 1,000 times, you're going to move to more advanced tools. But yeah, I think as long as when a researcher is doing their research, they want to go as fast as they can toward their results. They don't want to spend time doing things that probably aren't as interesting to them as their own discipline.
I actually think this is going to end up being one of the biggest challenges in computing and in interactive computing. And part of the reason for that is that whether you're talking about batch computing or a more immediate continuous access to computational resources, there is a tension and kind of an incompatibility between the timescales of computation, both in terms of speed of processing and, say, round-trip time to get computational results back, and the human timescales with which we interact, right? We interact on at the low end at the scale of tens of milliseconds, at the high end it's a scale of seconds, beyond which it's coffee break time. Whereas computation might take a very long time or a very short time. There might be a long round trip time. If you're dynamically interacting with a visualization, for instance, and it takes 700 milliseconds for your query that you've interactively expressed to go out, even to some set of online cloud resources, the computation gets distributed, completed, and returns, right? And this is a pretty good case scenario, right? It all kind of returns at the same time and happens within 700 milliseconds. It's coherent. That's still far longer than the 100 milliseconds at which we still see things as continuous. So you move the mouse, and then the whole thing stops, We can clearly see that 700 milliseconds. And so we can no longer do things like continuously interact to rotate a 3D presentation of some sort, or to move in virtual reality, or even to just drag a slider to filter some items in a very high volume scatter plot, for instance. So there are some really deep technical questions here as well. If we take, as Jack was saying, that the answer is supposed to be yes, the question then becomes, how do we do these things given the incompatibilities between our natural human physical or computational resources?
Thank you, Chris. And we have also comments from TV Land. I don't think it will completely supplant the command line. I want to code to generate job scripts and code post-processing to generate new jobs based on outputs of previous jobs. And Dana responded, yes, people who need things that the tools don't do will always be around to need to do heavy lifting themselves or with research computing collaborate. Any further comments? Let's go to the next question. What is something unexpected or interesting that people find as a result of doing usability UX visualization? So Paul, you want to start?
Sure, since that was my question. I think, so I've done a number of usability consulting engagements and also run workshops where I get the workshop attendees to actually, to first observe a live usability test and then conduct one on their own. This is through the Science Gateways Community Institute that I'm involved in. And I think without exception, people are always surprised by what they find when they do a usability, even a very simple usability test, even if it's not on their own website. I think the number one thing that people are surprised about is that the users that they're testing with don't have the same mental model about the product as they do. And I mean, that's sort of the number one rule of user-centered design, but people never seem to appreciate it until they experience it themselves. And that's one of the things that I use to drive home the value of doing actual testing with users, is that if you're the developer of something, there's no way for you to really get out of your own mental frames to put yourself in someone else's position. And so the worst error you can make is to think that all the users are just like you. And so I think that's the number one sort of unexpected thing. Of course, all the things that people find are all different depending on the context, but more generally, that's sort of the surprising thing that people find out.
Thank you, Paul. Oh, thank you, Paul. Yes. Dana?
Yeah, so trying to think of the angle on this from, where I sit in research computing, and thinking over the last 5 years and how this role of the researcher facing person has become, something we all accept as a needed thing. And I see it as kind of two components. The one we see a lot now is helping researchers figure out how to even use the technology. And then there's this side where the technologists, Science Gateways and things are making these things more usable. So, that's kind of researcher facing too. Now, if we do a really good job with usability, will we not need the kind of researcher facing person that has to hold the researcher's hand to show them how to do all their workflows and get all these things done? I think it's an interesting question to see how far we can go, but I think so I think the result is, what I've seen is, over the last 5 years in general, we've seen an evolution from you know, if you can't learn to use the Linux command line, then you don't deserve to use advanced computing, to the idea that now we see that, you know, research and advancement of science can go so much further if research computing comes to the researchers and meets them where they are, and we get new discoveries that way. So it's exciting to see how far we can get with all of the with the usability, and make the researcher facing people's jobs easier too.
Thank you, Dana. Give it to Chris.
So I agree very much with what Paul said in terms of how surprising it is when user interfaces work or don't work for the intentions that you have in mind. And that's in my introduction, I mentioned trying to be a neutral methodologist, and that I guess is part of my strategy for taking myself out of that loop of deciding what the purposes of an interface should be. But I wanted to address the point of data. One of the surprising things to me on the various application projects that I've worked on is that data, everybody thinks of data as this nice concrete thing. We've studied our natural or social or built system. We've reduced it to a nice data set through a lot of effort. And then I come in as the visualization person and start to ask questions about, well, what does that data column mean? What does that particular value mean? How are you going to interpret it? What kind of operations do you want to perform on that data that I should somehow capture as an interactive query in a visualization? And it almost always stuns me that their answer is, well, we've collected the names, or we've collected the numbers, and there they are. And I asked them, what do these data values actually mean? And they say, well, they're floating point numbers, right? If they're programmers, they'll say they're doubles or floats or something like that. And so the surprise to me is that collectively, we have very little knowledge of the data that we're collecting. And we spend relatively little time really understanding what it is that we're putting into data. We kind of take data as this concrete, clean, nice thing that we can trust. As I often say, we kind of put data up on a pedestal, but we need to spend more time thinking very carefully about the structure of the data, what goes into it, our processes for collecting it, because those things affect the entire computational pipeline, both before we've collected the data and after we've collected the data. So my encouragement to you is, if you work with data at all, spend more time keep thinking very carefully about what each of those data values in your spreadsheet or your database actually mean, beyond, say, programmatic types.
Thank you to you all. So we have some comments from TV Land. I agree, Galaxy, with David, things like Galaxy are great when you have a couple of FASTQ files. That are sequential files. Okay. You want to explain it? No. So FASTQ files are, for example, for genomic data. It's just a file format. Genomic data, but when you want to assemble 1,000 genomes, you don't want to do that with point and click. Yes, I agree to that. And I do agree that improvements in usability are crucial to drive progress and research. The tool must become easier to use. I also agree to this, and I guess also our panelists. So let's go to the next question. Are there ways of getting started with usability UX visualization without requiring long-term training? So I would give this to Paul.
Sure. The short answer is yes. I'll elaborate in a second. I think that there are one trend that we're seeing recently is for people to do a lot of quick training in UX design. There are all kinds of boot camps that last, that span from a weekend to a few weeks. And I think there's a danger in those, in that people come out with a false sense of competence. Anything that's reasonably complex, can't be mastered in a weekend. And I think the people in the industry are aware of that. Here at Purdue, we have a 4-year undergraduate degree in user experience design. So these students are spending 4 years, and they come out with a lot of deep knowledge, and they know how to apply it in all kinds of contexts. And that's not something you can get in a weekend. Now, that being said, I think there are ways to develop some skills and a basic level of competence in doing usability testing, and those don't require a great time investment. Sandra showed a few screenshots of a few books at the beginning. There are books out there that are geared towards non-experts, that are very digestible, easy to read. They tell you how to conduct a quick usability test. And these are the kinds of things that I do in the Science Gateways workshops. I take people who potentially know nothing about usability, and after an hour, get them to run their own usability test. So I think those things are possible, and I would highly recommend them. And if you search online for how to conduct a usability test, or ask Sandra the name of some of those books, those are great resources. They don't require a lot of time, and they can give you some basic skills to run your own usability tests, and those are actually, I think, highly valuable. And so that's, the short answer to that question is yes, you can do it, and you should do it, and it's not that hard.
Thanks, Paul. So there's one comment from Jack Smith. It is not so much about ease of use, but integrating real-time workflow into the computational ecosystem. I partly agree with that. I think it is about ease of use still, because if the user, as I said at the beginning, if you have to explain a user interface to a user, not as good. So if a user can directly grab a user interface and knows what to do, then it's also very complex tasks much easier for them to grab, I would say. Yeah, ease is relative. I agree, Jack. I agree. Ease is always relative. So, Dana, what is your answer to the question? Should I repeat the question because it's now a while ago?
It's been forever, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so the training, but are there ways of getting started with usability, visualization, UX without requiring long-term training?
So I was thinking of this question from the perspective of the researcher. And I think for that, my answer is that they should be collaborating with the research computing expert, right? It's like, we don't offer trainings for do-it-yourself brain surgery, or we don't require everyone to know how to fix their own car. They go to the expert to do all those things. And I think, as keep referring back to Scott Yokel's talk yesterday on the job families and this idea of professionalization of the research computing community as co-creators of these new things. And I think this is one of them, is that when you have any, discipline, everything's multidisciplinary now, right? And so you don't necessarily, you need to know enough about the other discipline to share a language and to find common goals, that we collaborate. And so just like, on the things we do in research computing, we may collaborate with social scientists to work on professionalization, for example, or evaluators to measure the impact of workshops. And just like researchers in various disciplines should be encouraged to collaborate with research computing people when that's where their research is going. So, you know, we're creating this whole new methodology, and I think that's part, you know, it should be a first-class citizen in the development of that new knowledge.
Thank you, Dana.
Slightly different question.
Visualization, there have been quite a few attempts over the years to provide tools for more popular accessibility of visualization design. One large and influential project was called Many Eyes at IBM, done by Martin Wattenberg and Fernando Viega. Now at Google, Fernando Viega is a particularly well-known name. You've probably seen a lot of her articles out there at one point or another. This Many Eyes system allowed people to upload small data sets through a web browser and use various controls to design, to pick which kind of visualization they wanted to use and design how the data would be, as we say, visually encoded as shape and color and so on within those visualizations. And they studied how people were using it as kind of a social networking environment as well. And what they basically found out is that it was a great way to create a million bad scatter plots and bubble charts, right? The kind of the expressive power of design that they could successfully get people to use was relatively limited. And part of the reason for that involves a lot of activities, each of which seems like it should be reachable with relatively little training, but as an integrated set of things is actually quite hard to accomplish. You have to be able to gather the data, represent your data in some reasonable way, format the data in some sort of format that can be delivered to the system. You have to know how to design the mapping of different data attributes into things like shape and color and so on, and do it in a way that's meaningful and usable perceptually and cognitively to some sort of user. You have to understand what kind of interactions you should support to allow people to navigate within a visualization, to select items in the visualization, and so on. These are a lot of parts, and each one is a huge active area of visualization research, as with visualization as kind of a sub-area in both HCI and cognitive psychology. And so it's kind of like the opposite of the brain surgery example. Brain surgery seems very far away. It seems like it automatically takes decades to work. Whereas visualization is like, oh, here are the things I need to learn. I'll just do them step by step. But each one of them actually involves a substantial amount of training and even a certain amount of art to be able to pull it off. Just learning the good ways, the basic good ways to map floating point values, integers, and strings into color, shape, and location, that actually requires a substantial amount of training to be able to do it well. And it's very easy for people to come in and just kind of throw something up and say, look, I have a visualization. And then what happens in that case, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words, and we believe everything that we say, or we believe everything that we read, and consequently visualizations can be very, very dangerous. It's very easy to produce, to show data in a way in which you see a pattern, but it doesn't mean anything, right? Or the meaning is very questionable, or it's just very hard to interpret. Right? So is it possible for people to come in and learn how to be practitioners? Absolutely. That happens all the time. But it takes years of effort and years of training, just like anything else that requires mastery.
Thank you, Chris. We have another comment from TV Land. A side note related to this in general. I think it would be useful to look at ideas from information systems research on technology adoption. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you talk about usability, if you look at how many smartphones Apple's are taken up in the last years, yes, it was because people got used to that. It's so much easier to wipe over the screen, to be able to do things on their phone. So absolutely. I mean, that is part of usability, and also in research, we should be aware, because yes, in the 90s, researchers didn't have another chance than go to the programs and command line interfaces, because you know, they have to use it the way they were. Nowadays, they have options and much more possibilities to go also to other products. So let's go to the next question. So what are trends which majorly influenced your area in the last 5 years? And I will start with Chris.
The machines are taking over. As of 3 years ago, most of the research and practice in visualization was still focusing on visual representation. What are the good ways to take data and turn it into some set of graphics that allows you to explore and see patterns in the data? In the last few years, I've seen at the main visualization conference, upwards of 50% of the papers start to move towards trying to provide use visualization as a user interface on top of machine learning algorithms of one sort or another. This is a little bit disturbing to me because kind of like the central tenet, kind of almost the covenant of visualization, is that we're serving human beings, and human beings are the source of the intelligence, right? The pattern recognition capability, the sense making, the decision making about what to do with the information that they see and how to progress in a computational process. And there's kind of this notion, I would go so far to call it a conceit in the machine learning community, that the human being can not only be augmented, but replaced with these machine learning algorithms, essentially taking humans out of the loop. I hope that's not the case. I also see a lot of examples of visualization being used to help machine learning researchers study their own algorithms, including the data structures like deep learning neural networks and so on. And that work is interesting because in that case, machine learning is kind of like the domain of application for visualization. And that's still good as well. But basically, the machine learning has been taking over within the visualization community, and I don't know whether it's a fad or not. Yeah.
I wanted to shorten the answer. I only wanted to show you on the screen. So.
Oh, I see. Well, there I am.
So, Paul?
Yeah, so I'll mention maybe four things. The first one, which was not really in the last 5 years, it was actually before that, was the introduction of mobile devices and the need to design for cell phones and tablets, and terms like mobile first and responsive design became popular, and people were concerned with, how do you allow people to do things that they do on their desktops on their mobile devices and make sure that the usability is, still good. And nowadays there are all kinds of software libraries, JavaScript frameworks that make that reasonably easy to do. And so I think, that was the first trend, a little bit older, that created some kind of shift in how we talk about usability. More recently, there are emerging technologies, or at least becoming more popular, like AR and VR. People are trying to figure out, how do we talk about usability in virtual environments when people are collaborating in virtual reality, for instance, when people are wearing AR headsets and they're interacting with things in the digital world and in the physical world together. And so that, I think, is very much an area of that's under development, and people are trying to understand what kind of methods and frameworks do we use to evaluate usability in those contexts. The third one is what we tend to call cross-channel usability or user experience, which means that people are not just interacting with data and information on a single desktop anymore. It's very common that people are using perhaps a machine in their office and at home, and then they're out on their phone and perhaps on the couch on their tablet, and they're interacting with the same kind of service. And so how do we make sure that the usability is good, that there's a holistic kind of experience that's being provided, that there's continuity across devices. And so that's something that's received a lot of attention in the past, certainly 5 or so years. And then I think the last one is somewhat related to what Chris was talking about, which is AI and machine learning. Mostly, at least recently, in the context of intelligent personal assistants, right? So everyone is familiar with Siri and Google Assistant and Alexa and so on. And these are presenting all kinds of usability, really well-established way to talk about or evaluate usability right now of these ubiquitous sort of artificial intelligences that are in our environments all over the place, listening to us, that we can talk to and ask to do things. So that's an area that's under a lot of current investigation. There are panels and talks and so on at the main human-computer interaction conference, in the past couple of years. And so that's a really hot area that's sort of reshaping in some ways how we view usability. So I think those are the 4 things that I'll touch on.
Thank you, Paul. Dana?
So I think the big thing is really the culture change that we're actually talking about this, because I remember, 5 years ago, Henry would always talk about, well, maybe not that long ago, but that when he's talking about training our users, it's like, well, now this is what they do, right? There's 3 clicks from an application, and it updates by itself, and it does all that. And the take-home message was that training our users is ever so much harder than it's ever been. But now we're saying, wait, this is what our users are used to, and the goal is shifted to making the advanced technology have a user interface as close to this as possible. So we've changed dramatically, the gap, or at least where we put the gap between the users and the technology. And I think that's really important and good. And if we think about, like the future, we see people, I keep hearing people doing gaming. There's I don't know, billions of hours a year is spent with humans interfacing with technology and games because they want to. Can we embed some science under there so that science gets done with all this, like the protein folding and things, where people were spending their fun time interacting with technology to actually move science forward? So that's where I'm going to leave that.
Thank you, Dana. From TV land or in the room to the panelists. Henry?
In this discussion is there's a very interesting, almost accidental alignment between what people in visualization and user experience and usability have to do, particularly I think in visualization, to understand the science that they're supporting or that they're collaborating with, that aligns really well with what research computing facilitators have to do, perhaps at a different pace, but to understand how someone talks about their research and to translate it into terms that resonate for yourself so that you can start to add value to what's going on in that area of science. We sort of have ways that we approach that, but I'm really curious, how do you approach learning a new science and adding value to the science that's being done in that discipline?
Oh, that is a hard question.
Good, because I want it to be a discussion. This is I want to learn.
So one of the things that I've learned as a visualization researcher and developer is that visualization is really an iceberg. The thing that you see is the tip of the iceberg above the water. There's the rest of the iceberg beneath the water. That is all the stuff that you need to learn about the data, where it comes from, how it gets processed, how it's already been processed before it even got to you, what kind of computations can be feasibly done to it, and whether the outputs would even make sense to a user just looking at it in a database or a spreadsheet, right? And so consequently, a lot of the work that I do is just being a computational researcher, right? The visualization is sometimes just an afterthought, even though for me, it's constantly in the back of my mind. And I've had projects where I have one right now where we haven't even gotten to the visualization. We've spent the entire time just trying to develop mutual understanding of what's going on in the data as a function of the phenomena and the observations that the domain scientists are actually thinking around.
So what's the process that you go through to accomplish that? If you had to teach your grad students, and I gather you do have to teach your grad students how to do that process, what do you tell your grad students, or what would you tell a new grad student coming in? Here's how we're going to tackle this new area of science you've never worked in before.
That's why this is a hard question.
Right.
Meaning I don't really have a good answer for it. The approach I've used so far, and I suspect that this is true of other developers within visualization, is that it tends to be more of an apprenticeship project. Process, right? So I have the graduate students, I involve them in as many of the meetings as we can. We have the meetings not be about logistics as much as possible. We actually sit down and spend time saying, okay, you've got this existing presentation of the data, or here are your set of observations that you have. What does this mean? What does this mean? Help me understand this aspect. How is it that you're thinking about these things? Well, we don't have a formal organization of that kind of conversation process that goes on. I don't know whether it's true in other fields of other areas of computation that aren't.
I don't think we have a formal process either, although what we're trying to get to is enough experience shared among us that we can start to see what the patterns are, even if we're only seeing them in an implicit way, rather than really sort of being able to articulate what those patterns are. But so I think what I'm hearing is you're going through the same thing. You can't articulate what the patterns are, but in the moment you sort of have a set of reactions that you can use to get you closer to the information you need, and you have your grad students watch you do that.
Absolutely, and a lot of it, which isn't always easy to get computer scientists students to want to engage in, right? They're interested in focusing their energies elsewhere, even if they're actually very skilled or potentially very skilled at the social aspects of doing this kind of work. I have a general sense of some of the higher level patterns that we're going through to try to understand that, hey, help me build a mental model of the data that corresponds enough to your mental model of the data, kind of interpreted through your scholarly norms, right, and processes, enough of an understanding when I start computing against and displaying the data that you're giving me. Basically, I'm just badly misinterpreting what the data is supposed to mean. It's very easy to jump in with Viz, and this has happened to me, right? It's like, oh, cool data. I designed a Viz and come back and everybody says, ooh, visualization, right? And it goes up on websites and gets reported in grants and everybody's happy. And I'm like, crap, right? You know, that visualization, I happen to know, I just threw it up and I have no idea whether it's useful or meaningful to these people. So over the years, I've had to kind of take a step back and say, I'm not going to do that anymore. That kind of gratuitous computation, gratuitous visualization. But as far as like the finer grain steps that we can kind of write down, here's a strategy and a process for you to follow as a computational developer to how is it they work. That finer level of detail, we for the most part don't have that. There is some of that I think within the information sciences, the iSchools, Library Information Science. On one of our projects, one of our collaborators, Janavis, she does usability stuff, but also information organization stuff. And she goes out and she interviews people, right? So there's that kind of a social science process that they follow to try to do that. But it only kind of, it connects with the technical aspects of the development in a relatively limited way. The work that she's done then kind of gets handed off to me. Here are the big things that we've learned. Now go develop stuff. I'm kind of in the same boat. I'm kind of still trying to understand what the translator has said about what the domain scientist said. So a lot of work to do, I think.
So, Paul, do you have also opinion about how to, you know, or whether you have a plan for the communication with?
Yeah, sure. So it is a very difficult question. And I think, like Chris was saying, we tend to do a lot of sort of ad hoc things to try to align mental models. And we sit down, we have conversations, and we say, you know, what are you thinking about this? And we come back and say, well, here's what we think you mean. You know, does this align? And we go back and forth and try to make sure we're speaking the same language. There's another thing that we do that I'll mention, which people might not be familiar with, which is something called co-design. And this has a long history and it's used in various ways, but it can be used in this kind of context. And what it means essentially is that we're working with the domain experts to actually design something together. And that is not necessarily the final product. It can just be a short term, you know, we might sit down for half an hour or an hour and say, let's all work together. We're all designers on this and we're all part of a team. And we try to co-design something. So I've done this a few times working with companies, and it's actually quite enlightening. There are some kind of power dynamic shifts that happen when you sort of place people in that situation, and you say, well, we're all here together as designers, and sometimes we'll record the sessions, and so we can go back and look over the data and try to figure out how people are thinking. But that's a simple method that can be used, and it often sheds a lot of insight on how the domain scientists are thinking about the problem. And you might notice things that they wouldn't necessarily articulate because they're perhaps not aware of them, but they come out through those sessions. And they can be really simple. You can just do things on the whiteboard and say, let's try to throw together an interface, or let's talk about navigation of a website, and we'll all design together. So in addition to those other, you know, just sort of sitting down and conversing, I've found that to be a useful method that that others might, you know, want to try out and might also find useful.
Thank you, Paul. Dana?
Well, I think it depends so much on what the discipline is that they're working in, right? Some disciplines already know what computers are capable of, and so they recognize that, you know, oh, I could do this, but maybe they just don't know how to implement it or whatever. And those tend to be easier. But there's some disciplines that they don't realize what computers are capable of. And I don't mean that in any sort of condescending way at all. It's just that, you know, if their experience is really a phone and web interfaces that do what somebody else told it to do already, they may not realize what they could do. And so I'm a big fan of finding out kind of what are the first, you know, kind of a high level view of what are the big questions in their discipline. You know, if you ask a researcher what they do, they will love you and talk for a long time. And if you're lucky like me to have an insatiable curiosity about stuff, it's actually fun because you call it work, but really you're learning things. And then just like everyone else has said, it's really kind of developing a relationship and learning what the questions are they're trying to answer and seeing how you can help them get there.
Many thanks, Dana. Any further questions? I think we almost reached the time. I do one experiment. Paul, would you mind leading Chris to one of your fastest usability tests with eBirds to show it to the room?
Oh, you want to do it right now? Right now?
Yes.
Sure, we
We
can.
have exactly 4 minutes.
Okay. Do you want to bring up? You want to bring up the website there?
You bring up the eBird slide. So it's,
This is David Ebert?
no, it's a.
Or is Ebert Ebert?
It's from
Oh, eBirds.
ebird.org, I think, right?
Yeah, I share the screen with you so that you can see what he's doing. Can I? Let me share. Can I do that? So that is, you said you're fine for a surprise, so Chris, that is your surprise? No, it's not. No, so Paul will walk you through. It's not a test at all. It shows.
That's what we say to all our participants.
You have to think out loud when you put it.
Okay.
So Paul, will you walk him through?
Sure, yeah. So just for the sake of everyone in the room, so this is a common thing. I just bring someone up and pull up a site and give them a task to do and just observe how they do it and notice any usability issues. So what I've been telling people is go to eBird, and I want you to, I'm not going to tell you how to do it, just find when I can find a particular bird, okay, which is called a Nelson sparrow, in my county in Indiana, which is Tippecanoe County. So that's your task. What time of year can I find a Nelson sparrow in Tippecanoe County, Indiana? And then I'll just sit here and observe and notice how the user does what they're doing, and it's quite enlightening.
Think out loud what you're doing.
Okay, so from the website I saw an image saying find something, so I presumed that would lead me to a query interface of some sort. And then I saw an image at the top that also looked like a kind of a map query interface. So I clicked that, and it brought up this particular query interface here. Looking at the various controls that are available around, and thinking on my feet with all of you here, I tried to type in kind of a natural language query up here. But having had a little bit more time to look around the various controls, and there we go, we got a nice little pop-up, it doesn't say time. Let's see, I've forgotten the original query that I'm supposed to want to find the results for, but I typed in the species here. I typed in the location, which appears to be correctly typed. And at this point, I have a portion of what looks like something from the Google Maps API. It's showing me some streets, and that's about it. And at this point, I'm a little bit befuddled about what to do next, including the fact that I don't seem to be seeing the entire user interface here. Yeah, this is the point at which I might go browse something else. Yes.
Let me bring up the extension that Paul can. Oh no, we are in the Skype session. That's true. We are sharing the screen.
Depending on my motivation, my degree of motivation, at this point I would probably go back a link or two and spend more time reading the previous page to see whether or not this is the right interface for the purpose we have in mind, because I have noticed that there's, you got the scrolling. I'm recalling the query that Paul said originally somehow involved place, so maybe this would help me find it instead. But this is talking about hotspots instead, rather than the species of the bird. So I don't know how to enter that. I don't know what this is. This one doesn't seem to be live. Something else going on here. So here's the thing. I've done HCI and visualization for 20 years. I've seen thousands of interfaces, and I don't know what to do with this thing. Right? One of the things I'm observing is it appears that there are a lot of kind of like small ways of doing different kinds of queries kind of scattered throughout this interface, and I need to figure out kind of what the web designer's story has been to lead me to the particular thing that I have in mind. And that was for a question Paul had specified. I might not even have a question in mind. Actually, I have a question in mind. Might make that actually quite a bit easier. At this point, I think I might start just hunting and pecking, saying, does this thing do what I want? Does this thing do what I want? Does this thing do what I want? After 10 minutes of that, I might try to find some help somewhere on this page. Look at about, I would look at help and try to see how to do the thing that I want to accomplish with my first game.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I can promise you, of course, selected that website, or for selected that website because it's tough. It would have been obvious. This would have been, of course, not so much fun for us. So, Paul, do you want to say a couple of things?
Yeah. So this was a bit of a bit contrived and obviously under a bit of time pressure, which is not that typical, but it's quite enlightening. I did a session, a workshop a few months back where I had 3 people come and do this task. 2 of them couldn't get it after about 10 minutes. And one of them did get it, which is actually a bit unusual. It turns out there's something on the home page that you just need to click on, and then it's very straightforward and you can find it. But people tend to not do that. And by having a few different users go through that scenario, you actually learn a lot about the way that people think about navigating websites, for instance, and how they perform tasks, and you learn a lot about the usability of the site as a result. So it seems very simple and a little bit contrived, but that's something that everyone can do. If you have a site and you know that there are common tasks that people do, just grab somebody, as long as they have the requisite background knowledge, and say, do this task, and just observe them. And it's interesting. You can learn a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being the guinea pig, Chris. Yeah. Are there further questions? Otherwise, I would say many thanks to our panel.